Okay, this was going to be my comedy lead slide on Ukraine. Prigozhin's written a child's book, but obviously events have overtaken that, and we see at 2 this morning Ukraine time. Somebody blew that dam, the Kakhovka Dam. I'm not saying that right, but the Zaporizhia power plants up here. The Dnipro goes down to Kherson on the right bank, held by the Ukraine, and left and right, by the way, is defined by which way the river's going. You're going down the river, the right bank's on your right-hand side. The left bank is where the Russians are, and it's a much lower side. So I think the Russians maybe were a little bit worried that this offensive was going to overrun them there. So they flooded the playing field. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on unfolding events. I'm just going to look at the last 400 years of water in the Crimea, because obviously this relates directly. And this is taken from when we were talking about the history of Crimea. And I made the point that Crimea has always needed the support of the northern steppes. Now you can consider the Ukraine northern steppes. We can debate about that, but the Crimea has always been dependent on the main land area here for water. So when it was inhabited by the Tatars, who'd been there ever since the Mongols came through, the Tatars, and being a Muslim, they were supported obviously by Istanbul. They've always had to strike deals with whoever held the upper reaches of the Dnieper. And it was first it was the Cossacks, and so we can take that back to the mid 1600s. So that's why I say 400 years. And then Catherine built some canals and took over Crimea and made sure that there was a water supply. So that's the old history. Since communist time, so let's skip forward to 1951. Everybody saw the potential for a dam there, and it was Khrushchev's dream. Now, Khrushchev was Ukrainian, and so he put that on the front burner. But even before he took power, which I think was in 1954, that was on Stalin's agenda, and they issued this stamp in anticipation of the great project that was started finally in 1957. So this is the dam that just got blown up. The Russians built it, and the Russians blew it up. And so the other thing that to illustrate the point I've been making, there's always been some kind of conveyance of fresh water. I say always. I think from the time of Catherine, a canal. And the Tatars, the northern Crimean Tatars, use that water for farming. So this is the breadbasket of Crimea, if you will, but it relies on Dnieper water. And so knowing that, just keep this red line in mind as we go through, because this is going to have run-on effects blowing up the dam. The canal begins right from the reservoir. that has been created by the dam, and there's a big power station there. So this is a key area, and this is where the explosion was. In the Crimea, this is the canal when it's open, going across northern Crimea. When Russia invaded the Ukraine, the Crimea specifically, Ukraine put up a dam on the north part of the canal to block the water supply going down to the Crimean Peninsula. And so what that did was that dried up the canal from 2014 to when Russia invaded last year. And so that was a big crisis. And one of the reasons that Putin decided he was going to go and take Crimea back. As you can see, most of it went to agriculture, but some of it went to drinking water. So until Putin invaded, he had to make other arrangements. And so as soon as Putin invaded last year, he blew up that obstruction dam that the Ukraine had built in 2014 to thwart him. And so all this mucking around with their water has got the Tatars very much involved. And I think we looked at some statistics and poll numbers, and they're inching to the side of Ukraine. All right. So last week, we looked at China, so we're turning to China now. If anybody wants to has something to say about Ukraine. So last week with China, we had reviewed their historical grievances, and now I ask you the question: from our point of view, do we think that those are fair? And I want to look at the early contact between America and China. And by early, I mean really early. So here we're talking about 1787, before the Constitution. And the motive for the Americans was that old thing about the Northwest Passage, that myth of the Northwest Passage that we looked at when the Spanish were here. And the Astor had an ability to make a lot of money. And it was summarized by a biographer that he could run with the ideas of other men, and he got a monopoly on the fur trade. But he also got involved in smuggling opium into China, which was disappointing for me. I thought that my vague recollection was the Opium Wars was a British thing. But we had our hands in that too. So Astor, he saw an opportunity with fur. There was a demand for fur in China, and Russia supplied some of that and answered some of that, but it wasn't enough. Astor saw an opportunity and created the American Fur Company, and sent ships to Canton quite early. So we're in the early 1800s. And he built a fort at the mouth of the Columbian River And it was the first American-owned settlement on the Pacific coast of North America. So obviously, this is going to relate to our history of California. We're kind of stuck at 1542, but we're going to be going back, and I'm going to be spending some time talking about California today. So there's a nice overlap. The War of 1812 presented some problems. The British flexed their muscle and crowded out Astor, and the British took over his trading post for fur, and that's what got him into opium smuggling. It was just to get past the British aggression in the War of 1812. And opium was a long tradition, but it didn't penetrate very much below the upper classes. But all of a sudden, we supplied more than enough for everybody. And you can see the graph of tons per year of opium into China, and how it took off, really.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
I got a question. Oh, I thought opium came from Afghanistan and the poppies and I don't think we grow that in this country, do we?
No. This was the British were getting it from their Indian colonies.
Right, from the North India.
So okay. They were bringing that they wanted to buy a lot of Chinese goods, and they didn't have anything that the British didn't, or produce anything that the Chinese wanted. They had their own silk. They didn't need cotton, blah, blah. And so Britain used the opium that had been harvested in India in their China trade. But obviously some of it was secret. So they got their cash by smuggling in opium. So,
right, and getting people addicted. But I think the opium triangle, the poppy triangle, is actually up in the mountains. I think it's more Afghanistan. I think it's north of India. I don't think India itself.
Well, the golden triangle involves Burma and Thailand.
Right.
That's the golden triangle.
I bet the British were getting it from there.
Well, the British were all, that was part of the East Asian,
East Indies.
Asian
country. Right. Okay, I just clarifying, because I mean, I thought something like 95% of the world's opium comes from that area. It's been something that's been in the eyes of the American. Anyway. Okay.
Yeah, and as we learned when we studied the Pashtuns, the British tried very hard to control Afghanistan, and contrary to rumor, they were successful ultimately in controlling Afghanistan, but it was only for a couple of decades. But they probably were involved through Indian trade with the Afghanistan growers. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And so opium smoking just lingered on into the Second World War, really. And it took something like the Communist Revolution to get rid of it, and get rid of the corruption in the upper classes that went along with that. After going back to Astor, after he got over the fallout from the War of 1812, Congress helped him out and passed some protectionist laws that kept foreigners out of the fur business in America. And so before you knew it, he was racking up millions in otter and beaver pelts. eventually the market got saturated, and his fur company went bankrupt, but he'd already diversified into New York real estate. So that's why we hear Astor's name, and why there's a city in one of the New York areas called Astoria. Okay, now this is, Shigeko, what I promised earlier. And it starts with a very simple question. How did Burlingame get its name? And you're wandering through the library, and the point that we've tumbled to a number of times, if you see something interesting you don't quite understand, or a statue, read the label. And then in this day and age where we can satisfy our curiosity by going home and Googling stuff, you learn that this statue of Burlingame was donated by a Chinese artist. And then you look into Burlingame's history and you realize he was Lincoln's ambassador to China. And then you start looking under rocks and going down rabbit holes, and you get a very interesting story. He went to Harvard Law School. I'm going to give a little bit more of his early childhood in just a second, but I want to tell you why he's famous. Went to Harvard Law School, became a mover and shaker in the Republican Party, the anti-slavery party, because he was an abolitionist. And as many of the abolitionists were, he was religious. Yeah, Bob.
Oh, this is now outdated by about 2 minutes. When you mentioned Astor going into New York real estate, I think it was 1840 something. I was just going to add that I only learned the other day that Walt Whitman financed his self-publication of his first 800 copies of Leaves of Grass from his own speculation in Brooklyn real estate. That's the end. That's all. Back to Burlingame.
All right. Thank you for that tidbit. We're always looking for
about the same time. I think it was 1850 odds, right? Okay.
Yeah. It's we're always looking for connections of history with anything. Connection to the arts certainly qualifies. So Burlingame really earned his political spurs after the attack on the house of Charles Sumner by a pro-slavery guy named Brooks. And everybody was horrified, but Burlingame got on the House floor and gave a speech that called Brooks the vilest sort of a coward. Those are fighting words, right? Is your hand up again, Bob? I can't tell.
No, I'll put it down.
Okay. So he was challenged to a duel, which was fine with Burlingame because he was a well-known marksman. And it fell to Burlingame to pick a dueling spot as the one who was challenged. And he selected Niagara Falls because dueling in the United States was no longer legal. So Brooks, dismayed by Burlingame's unexpected enthusiasm and hearing that he was a marksman, neglected to show up, as the book says. So this artist, who was the artist that did this statue, and why? Why would he have? Well, Burlingame, when he was Lincoln's ambassador to China, developed a more cooperative attitude towards China. Where's Burlingame now when we need him? A positive thinker. And I think this is where his Christian mindset comes in. And he ditched the old imperialistic doctrine and issued violence. But what's more, he lobbied other Western powers to do the same and to stop interfering in the internal affairs of China. So there was a timeout of global colonialism during the 1860s. Remember, we're just about ready to go into civil war. And Burlingame said, let's do some treaties, and this time let's put a nice Christian construction on it to appeal to the European powers, and let's respect China's borders. So that was Burlingame, and so the Asian community in living in the town of Burlingame looked up and said, well, why is this city named Burlingame? So Burlingame, on his way back and forth from Washington, D.C. To China, would often stop in the Bay Area, and he fell in love with it. He was well placed. He was a famous Republican by then. And so he met Ralston, the banker, who made all of his money and I think the silver mines. And Ralston said, well, if you like it out here so much, I certainly like you. I've got a piece of land for you. And so he bought a big ranch. Let's see, here it is. It was 1/3 of a Ralston property in San Mateo. I don't know exactly what third it was. This is the best I could do. I promised you that I was going to say a little bit more about his childhood, because I'm always interested when a man like this, in very mean times, comes up and seems to have a nice ideology. And this information comes from a wonderful news source for me, the New York Times Time Machine. So they could go back to the year Burlingame died, which was in 1870, and find an interview that one of their reporters did with a playmate of Burlingame's early years in Ohio. And you can actually see the original print. I looked at it and I've summarized it over here. It says, his father was a generous and kindly natured man with the advantages for education and culture above the average pioneers. Okay, so that makes sense. He's going to be a lawyer after going to Harvard Law School. But this is the religious part. Both his parents were devout Methodists in a very religious time. So we're talking now about the 1820s. And this is the time of the Second Great Awakening. We know the First Great Awakening was in the 1600s in colonial times. But the Second Great Awakening was in the 1820s. And that's where the American missionary movement really started. We were sending missionaries around the world in the 1820s because of this Second Great Awakening. And his parents were from upstate New York, which was a hotbed of religious reformation, if you will. This, for instance, is where Mormonism started. And why in upstate New York? One of the theories is it was the confusion and the displacement and the activity of building the Erie Canal. that kind of a construction project that moved and rooted up so many people led to a religious revival of sorts. In any case, Joseph Smith came out of that and established Mormonism. The other thing that came out of that tradition is camp meetings. And there was a third Great Awakening, and some people say we may be in the fifth Great Awakening. I won't take time today. That's for American history. But my parents were from central Kentucky, and they went to tent meetings. And my neighbor was from northern Tennessee, and his family went to tent meetings. So his father was very instrumental in the church and built the community church. His profession was as a school teacher. Therefore, he was a brilliant conversationalist. Was welcomed in every cabin. But he was impractical and unthrifty. And one of the quotes, the forest suffered little at his hands. Okay. So upon his retirement, here's the kicker to this story. He retired from the American diplomatic corps, but the Chinese government were so pleased with him. This is the Qing dynasty. That they appointed him Chinese ambassador, envoy extraordinaire. And he headed a Chinese diplomatic mission to the United States and a tour of Europe. And he took with him 2 Chinese ministers, an English and French politicians, 6 students from Peking. He gave a series of speeches across the country, eloquently argued in favor of a welcoming stance for the Chinese, which was, as we know from the history of San Francisco, at odds with what was going on in the Bay Area. And his mission concluded with the Burlingame Treaty. So this guy named a city on the peninsula and had a treaty named after him, and it was considered the first equal treaty between China and the West, and it was really the first clear statement of American policy towards China. So to and from China is what you see, that phrase. He was an ambassador to China and from China. The Chinese artist that did this was a documentary maker who came to America originally to do research on the Chinese laborers building the transcontinental railroad. But he heard the story about Burlingame from the Asian community on the peninsula. So when he got back to China, he dug through the Beijing archives, which reinforced the stories that he'd been told in America. So he created the bust of Burlingame and he donated it to the city. Okay, the Burlingame Treaty, how could it succeed? It couldn't because they were the same upsides and downsides that we have in this country. It helped China immensely. It gave them the most favored nation status, but it ensured the steady flow of low-cost Chinese immigrants, which American labor, particularly in San Francisco, resented. So while industrial leaders celebrated, the American labor didn't. And so that led to this tremendous backlash. We're familiar with backlashes from immigrants and in our current day and age. And this political cartoon shows Chinese workers breaking through a gate that was labeled the Burlingame Treaty. I misspelled that, sorry. With Uncle Sam standing off to the side, scratching his head and wondering why the scarecrow hadn't worked. The scarecrow is Dennis Kearney. So the next time you're walking around San Francisco, you walk on Kearney Street, but it's not that Kearney. There was an army leader named Kearney. Dennis Kearney is a different guy, and he was the fiery Irishman that prodded the laborers in San Francisco to be so awful. All right. So there was this huge step backward from the 1860s to the 1870s. Burlingame died in all places Russia, negotiating a treaty in St. Petersburg. After his death, there was a retreat from the Burlingame Treaty. Violence ticked up. It was grassroots violence. And shortly thereafter was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So anti-Chinese legislation expanded from California to the nation as a whole. But Japan too rewarded Burlingame, and he was given this bonsai, which is on display in the gardens of Lake Merritt next time you wander through there. Okay, moving ahead 25 years or so, then the European great powers have decided to carve up China into spheres of influence. The Americans objected, probably out of a concern for free trade and that they'd be cut out of the market. They said they didn't want to see China carved up like Africa, yet America went into the Philippines, much to Mark Twain's disagreement. What are you holding up there, Pepper?
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
not terribly relevant. Just yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought you were vying for attention. No.
Oh no.
Okay.
Right.
The United States makes a clear policy statement, opening the door to everybody. So let's flash forward another 40 years. FDR embraced China as a great power, probably because as much because of the support during World War II. And of course, we relied on China, and China relied on us in World War II. We had no way getting into Eastern China, so we flew over the Burma Hump, which was quite an airlift of goods to Chongqing. We tried, FDR at least honored China, and the American envoy, and this is after FDR died, so Truman's president now, Patrick Hurley arranged, imagine it was like what Jimmy Carter did at Camp David, a couple of weeks of these two guys together to get them to give China some sort of post-war stability. The Japanese had just suffer at the hands of atomic bombs, and they wanted China to have a peaceful future. So it wasn't for a lack of trying. Flash forward another 20 years, and we're living under the shadow of the ultimate of anti-immigrant philosophy and action, and that was in the 1920s, where immigration was restricted, not just to Asians, but also to Southern Europeans. So Northern Europeans were favored, but just like Donald Trump wanted to favor Scandinavian countries and not shithole countries. And that got redressed by LBJ in his first State of the Union speech after Kennedy was assassinated. And he called on Congress to pass Kennedy's immigration reform bill. And he worked with Ted Kennedy. We know there was a lot of tension between the Kennedys, particularly Bobby, and LBJ. But to get this done, they worked together, and the legislation was signed appropriately under the Statue of Liberty, and immigration from Asia was opened up. And it was Chinese immigrants that led the way, from Taiwan and Hong Kong in particular. So flash forward another 15, let's see how many years would that, not long, another 7 years, and you have Nixon in China. And when you look at it, no matter what we think about Nixon, no matter what we think about Kissinger, this is huge. 40 years, and China goes from being one of the poorest countries. It's been the largest single drop in global poverty ever. And most of that is China. Now, we opened it up diplomatically, but it was the Chinese diaspora who had fled China, either because of all the instability and warlords ever since the fall of the Qing, or from the communist, the anti-capitalist. So Singapore and Taiwan had taken off economically, and they were more than glad to fund China's rise during Deng Xiaoping era, which roughly is 1980 to 30 years, I probably should have said. But then there's been new grievances that have popped up over the last 10 years. And why on earth should China be grieved over the last 10 years? Well, look at the map. American bases, allies, who we've been outreaching to, even around China. One of our key allies is Vietnam. Of course, the Philippines is back as an ally, having opted out during the Duarte years. Of course, we have South Korea and Japan, and up until recently, we've been in Afghanistan. We had bases in Kyrgyzstan when we were fighting the Taliban. So Kissinger pointed out that the two board games contrast between the Chinese board game of Go and the Western board game of chess. Now I say Western, it's probably came from India, but the worst thing that can happen to you in Go is to be surrounded so you can't move. And that, I think that's the way the Chinese feel about the way our policy unfolded in this century. Kissinger wrote a very good book on the history of Chinese diplomacy. I can't recommend it enough. In spite of his other activities, he wrote a good book. So I probably won't finish all of this. I'm gonna just say something about the industrial policy and what the Chinese industrial grievances are, because that's what's on the headlines today. They point out that for developing countries, it's just standard to license foreign technology and try to upgrade your own local industry. And of course, the state's going to pick growth sectors. Sure, that's much more effective in a autocracy, but it does happen in a democracy. And so the Chinese point out, just look at the way you guys industrialized. Why are you picking on us? This is a headline, an article, "The Spies Who Launched America's Industrial Revolution." Ramsey talked about how textile mills came to this country and how an American pretended to be a tourist and kept touring the textile mills over and over again, and came home and wrote down and diagrammed how the machines worked. Certainly we all know from the biography of Alexander Hamilton how much he was involved. This person points out the pirates 200 years ago were Americans. They were the China of the 19th century. I want to put a face on some of the personalities that are commenting on industrial policy. So there's a couple of slides featuring this guy. He's the one that I've been quoting that says America talks like Jefferson but acts like Hamilton. Jefferson was this ideal free economy, small farmers, but it was Alexander Hamilton who came in with interventionist policy and the first bank, and China's quite proud of what they've done, and they want to share their expertise with the developing countries, which is why they have such a strong relationship with the global South, with Africa in particular. And he complains, and yet the whole way they've been badgered by Americans talking about limited government. That's been our mantra. Government shouldn't play such a large role in the economy, but Hamilton did. But it was Reagan and Thatcher who really turbocharged our anti-statism look, and the way we looked with suspicion on state-owned enterprise, also abbreviated SOE, state-owned enterprise, and that's what we've been attacking, the way Chinese have so much state-owned enterprise. So this guy, he wears many hats. He's an academic now, but he was the chief economist at the World Bank, so he knows about, Lin knows what he's talking about. And he again says that it's quite normal for this state to support education and infrastructure. We do it. We've done it. Al Gore took pride in inventing the internet. And government finance basic research has underpinned a lot of stuff. We all know that. But now Biden has actually gone even further in his not state-owned enterprise, but the state helping American enterprise, subsidizing and setting up a unlevel playing field for computer chips. So Ramsey talked about the Bretton Woods settlement, and the Chinese noticed, but look what happened with Trump. He sabotaged the WTO arbitration process by blocking the appointment of judges to adjudicate complaints between members. And Biden has only partially reversed that. And the other thing that Trump did turned out to be good for China. In his mindless anti-Chinese rhetoric, he thought, I guess mindless anti-Hillary mindset. If she was for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, then he was against it, right? That's kind of polarization makes us stupid. And it was really a stroke of luck for Beijing, because the Trans-Pacific Partnership was uniting everybody but locking China out. Well, China was pissed off about that and more than welcomed Trump's pulling out of that. So a stroke of luck. But it's always been something that the West has been hypocritical on. They did some kind of fooling around when the Asian tigers started to take off, but we've always been hypocrites on agriculture, especially the EU, especially France, right? So, but yet we talk about free trade. So Wang Yi, I should say these days, is a former foreign Chinese minister, and I want to put a face on what he has to say, and then I think we'll close out and open it up for questions. So he touts the China infrastructure process, which has been done by state-owned enterprises, SOEs. And we've criticized China. Hey, these state-owned enterprises are doing getting more involved than American municipalities and infrastructure. Well, you know, it's hard. These definitions are very arbitrary. So but they've been successful. That no one can doubt that. And he points out that American crumbling private sector utilities have been put to shame. He sees some possible deals if the West would just show some humility and bond with Chinese growing confidence. Maybe China could give something by loosening cross-border data flows and open up their internet market. If only the WTO would establish some digital standards, some definitions on what basis is Huawei been excluded from Western markets? What is it specifically? We just quote security threats. Huawei's done some adjustments, but they haven't been sufficient. And he thinks there's a deal that could be made on state-owned enterprise as well. If we would just allow more tolerance for SOEs supplying public services, maybe we could get some sort of understanding. And this comes at a time, if you keep an eye on what's going on in America, we are having more public involvement with the economy. But China, this is a red line for them. They see this system of state-owned enterprises as working, and he doubts that America is going to come to their senses, and that because their motivation is just to maintain their dominance. I'm going to make a short shrift of this. Ramsey talked about the monetary fund and the dollar being the reserve currency and what that means. But in the shadow of the financial crises, and the way that we're using our advantage as the world's reserve currency, to be fair, even in this Ukraine war, punishing Russia, there is a growing feeling globally that we should not have hegemony over the world currency. And the yuan is being included more in so-called global currency baskets. So the question is, are we leveraging our privileged position too much? And by shutting China out of high-end chips and supercomputers, the Chinese think Biden's gone even further than Trump. So the Economist comes to this conclusion: stand up to China where necessary, but otherwise collaborate when possible. Nothing dramatic here. We just have to oppose autocracy, but we should do it reasonably without getting overheated. For sure, we shouldn't close off foreign Chinese students, executives, and in particular, that's just behaving like an autocracy. It's a hard balance to strike, but I think this is a good stopping point, and I'll just throw open for discussion.
John, I would just say, having been to China twice, one of the big philosophical differences there, it's the community first and the individual second. There was a saying when I was in China that no Chinese ever has a room to themselves. The least number of people you had in the room was when you first got married and there was only one other person. And that was in the 80s, 83. When I think the average person was living in 10 square meters, which is 300 square feet or something like that. It's not a lot of space. It's like a room. The average couple was living like in a 15 by 20-foot room apartment. So America, we prize the individual, but China really puts the community first. And I think we have trouble as a country understanding that, and we see it all as communism and socialism, and it's scary. But I think it's a major factor.
Yeah, and but some of it is Asian, some of it is Confucianism, which is sure. Obviously affected China, Japan too. And if you look at the Japanese homes, the size of them, Now, as their population shrinks, it's a little bit different. But when we traveled to Japan in the 70s, we could certainly see what you're talking about, David.
Yeah.
It's also a Scandinavian, not just Far Eastern idea of society too. The Scandinavians are very proud of what they call the Janta law, which says the individual is not more important than society, and you don't brag. Another aspect of that is you don't brag about what you achieve. And the Scandinavians also live in relatively smaller square footage homes than Americans. That's for sure.
Yeah.
As one example.
Yeah, and live happily. I think, if you look at the happy index, the Scandinavian countries historically have been some of
well, I don't know who puts that happiness index together, because I can assure you that my Danish in-laws complain bitterly, endlessly about the taxes they pay. But they also, I guess as part of the happiness, they're actually quite pleased with the public services they receive in return.
Yeah.
That's a whole other subject.
Well, it's interesting we're in Boston, and even the difference here where people pay quite a bit more in taxes, but the school systems are good. The public transit system is good. The T runs every 6 minutes. The streets are clean. There's very little homelessness. As we've moved west, we've sort of stripped away, and of course, Prop 13 in California and Reagan and Jarvis Gann, kind of perpetuated that. But yeah, it's sort of the East-West, but it's not. Yeah. I don't know what Australia's like by comparison.
By the way, just referring back to a comment that John made about, I think it was on immigration, that Trump had said, why do we have to accept people from shithole countries? Why can't we have them from Norway? That was at a point, by the way, where Norway had a higher percent, and still does, a slightly higher percentage of foreign-born citizens than the United States does. So I guess if we'd accepted the Norwegians, we would have actually, by some rule of math, have actually increased our percentage of non-European Americans. Anyway, just a sidebar. Norway's at about 17% foreign-born, and the United States is at about 14 or 15% foreign-born.
Is that the figure? We're only 14% foreign-born?
I think we've been 14, 15% for ages, actually.
Yeah.
John, you know better than me.
Yeah, that 14 is right. Bruce, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, this had totally off the subject, other than the fact that there was a note you're talking about earlier about opium, and it was just I think in the news today about the fact that the Taliban has done an amazing job of cutting the opium crops from what they were very high down to less than 20% of the acreage now, and of course it's killing still killing all of the people, because they basically don't even have enough money to live on anymore. So that was kind of an interesting sidelight of what the Taliban are trying to do as far as I guess assist in the getting rid of opium.
Yeah.
Okay, then I'll add just one other extraneous piece of information on that, I suppose. You probably already know it. That Johnson & Johnson, which is one of the several large pharmaceutical companies which produce opioid drugs, has its own extraordinarily large opium plantations in New Zealand. Since we were talking about the location of growing opium. You can check that out and Google it.
Okay. Jim Teisel.
I was just going to say that, don't you think Trump liked Norway because he imagined that those immigrating would be white?
Yes, and if you recall, the Secretary of Homeland Security at the time was a lady called Nielsen, whose forebears were Norwegian. But when asked about that very thing, she said, "I don't know." I think she said, I'm not sure what Norwegians look like." Something along those lines.
They look a little different than Haitians by and large.
I think one of the things that fell out of the COVID, I guess, in the early days was the amount of in Iceland. I know they were having a problem with basically the service people, and that they were basically in from Eastern Europe, and I believe, and they all went home with and. So the Icelanders were having to put up with, making their own beds, I guess.
Yeah, well, and some people say, what is it? It's no coincidence that when we were in Vietnam, opium became, we got the initial wave of opiate addicts. But it's almost every war. And then there was, what was the Iran-Contra? What was that whole, Ollie North was running guns for drugs. It's like wherever we've got a war, and when South America, it was coca and cocaine. And, we sort of, if you follow the arms and drugs over the history of the United States, it often is where we are. And, and the Taliban, sure, they're getting rid of the opium. Probably not good for Johnson & Johnson.
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. John,
Okay.
thanks again.
Okay. Next week, maybe we'll get back to Cabrillo.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.
They're not promised that, John.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Oh, John,
Yo.
I after the sale, we went to Point San Pablo. So do you know where Point Malati is?